Hi, everyone. My name is Tami Peterson, and I'm a PhD student in the Gratz Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. Thank you to Dr. Goldman for having me to present this guest lecture to all of you. I'm just going to share my screen here and go to a PowerPoint that I've prepared. The presentation is called The Holocaust, the Timeline of the Shoah. Current Holocaust historians have more and more begun to see the Holocaust not as just a singular event, but as a series of events. These events made up the whole that became the Shoah. In this presentation, the timeline of events will be considered to help increase an understanding of the Holocaust and its devastating impact upon world Jewry. Beginning with Hitler and his ascension to power in Nazi Germany, and ending with the liberation of Auschwitz. This 12-year period in the life of European Jews was unanticipated, transformative, and utterly devastating. Before beginning on this chronological journey, I'd like us to consider the sheer size of death during the Holocaust. This was the event that was responsible for the creation of the term genocide by Raphael Lemkin and used today still by the international community, as well as being a cause behind the creation of human rights as a worldwide concern. This first map shows the distribution and numbers of European Jewry in 1933. The total was 9.5 million. Over half of the world's Jews lived in Europe at various levels of integration into society. This second map shows the distribution and numbers of European Jewry in approximately 1950. The total was 3.5 million, which equaled about 35% of the world's Jewish population. Today, the number of Jews living in Europe equals 1.4 million, which is only about 10% of world Jewry, and the number continues to decline. Today, 46% of the world's Jewish population lives in Israel, and 40% lives in the United States. The world Jewish population has still never recovered its pre-Holocaust numbers and remains smaller than it was before the devastation of the Shoah. But if we look solely at the numbers, it's easy to lose sight of the personal lives upended, the small tragedies, and the toll on humanity's conscience. Of the 6 million, 1.5 million were children. This video is from Poland in 1938. Many of those depicted here would not survive. 2 out of every 3 European Jews died during the Holocaust. The tragedy was not only on the community itself, but on individual lives. The toll and the costs were immeasurable. Who each of these individuals could have become, who each of their descendants could have become, the scientific discoveries, the poetry, the music, and the worlds they would have created were lost forever. The 12-year Third Reich began in 1933 with Hitler coming to power as chancellor and the acquiescence of conservatives in the Reichstag, the heart of the German government. In particular, President Hindenburg believed he could control Hitler's worst impulses, despite Hitler having led an attempted coup against the government called the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923 with what is comrades that would then become the members of the Nazi Party. Economic conditions and inflation in Germany were at very high levels during the 1920s and early 30s. This coupled with the recent humiliation of the loss of the First World War by Germany, meant many were looking around for someone to blame. The fledgling Weimar Republic, which was active from 1918 to 1933, was unable to address the fears of the German populace, fears of communist revolution, poverty, loss of status for what they considered this great nation. Despite having served bravely in the German army during the War to End All Wars, what became known as the First World War, German Jews became an increasing target of far-right rhetoric in Germany. They were accused of, quote, stabbing Germany in the back and of being the enemy within that were responsible for the loss of the First World War. Hitler's anti-Semitic views were spelled out in his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, and that was written while he was in prison for the putsch in 1925. Jew hatred was at the core of his personal and political beliefs. While Hitler and the Nazi Party did not start right away with the most extreme measures, he maneuvered his way into power, and then once he was able, gained full power through a series of decrees, including enacting emergency powers after the Reichstag fire, an arson attack that was blamed on the communist opposition. The Enabling Act was forced through Germany's parliament on March 23, 1933, and allowed Hitler to enact laws without approval of the Constitution or of the president. When President Hindenburg died, Hitler assumed his title and declared himself the Führer, translated roughly as the leader. Having consolidated power, he murdered political allies that could potentially challenge him for leadership so that they didn't threaten the power that he had won. One of these instances was known as the Night of the Long Knives, which was in June and July of 1934, and resulted in the dissolution of the SA, also known as the Brown Shirts. This brought all military and paramilitary groups under Hitler's full control. Meanwhile, Hitler's Jew hatred never ebbed, and anti-Jewish laws became central to the goals of the Third Reich. The separation of Jews from public life began with a raft of laws meant to remove them from it. Many Jews in Germany believed that Hitler and the Nazis were an aberration, a stain on their nation that would soon disappear, that things would blow over. Unfortunately, with increasing speed, the Nazis began enacting anti-Jewish laws, including what became known as the Nuremberg race laws in 1935. Boycotts of Jewish businesses had now become codified in law and part of state policy. Defining Jews as a race, having borrowed from US race laws and ideas of eugenics that relied on the one drop of blood theory, anyone with Jewish blood was deemed to be a legitimate target. Judaism was racialized, and one could not convert to save their lives as Jews had under persecution elsewhere in the past. For many of Germany's highly integrated Jewish population, these changes came as a shock. As much as we know about what happened, there is no reason that any reasonable person would have predicted the Holocaust. While pogroms had been a regular part of Jewish life for centuries, the idea that they would be subjected to a systematic annihilation attempt was unfathomable. It wasn't only the Jewish population in Germany that was not aware of what was coming, but the world itself that failed to act. In 1936, the Olympics were held in Berlin and used by the Nazis to create a spectacle celebrating the Third Reich. While anti-Jewish laws increased and society became more radicalized, Germany continued to be treated as a member of the community of nations with very little opposition, despite egregious violations of the Versailles Treaty enacted after the Second World War, meant to stop the country from rearming. Tourists continued to travel there, few noticing the increasing decline of Germany under the Nazis. The turning point for a lot of Jewish people in Germany was Kristallnacht, roughly translated as Night of the Broken Glass. This was a reference to the destruction and burning of Jewish shops, synagogues, It has also been referred to as Pogromnacht and even Night of the Feathers by Jewish women because of the feathers flying around from Nazis having ripped open beds, as well as the much rarer spoken of instances of raping Jewish women. Even before Kristallnacht, the increasing persecution of Germany's Jews led to an international conference on the issue of Jewish refugees being held in Evian in July 1938. It was a missed opportunity and ended with no nation agreeing to take Jewish refugees except the Dominican Republic. This unfortunate pattern of world indifference to Jewish suffering was to continue. One notable exception that resulted in saving lives was the British Kindertransport that saw the rescue of 10,000 mostly Jewish children from the Nazis before the Holocaust in the years 1938 to 1940. Beloved children's figure Paddington Bear was based on the children of the Kindertransport, complete with name tag, the same the children had worn when they were sent alone by their parents to a foreign country to save their lives. Most of their parents would perish in the Holocaust. In May 1939, in another instance of world indifference, a boat of Jewish German refugees boarded the St. Louis and sailed for Cuba, where many of the passengers had been told they were granted asylum. Due to the dishonesty of some officials involved when the ship arrived, they were not allowed onto the island. Jewish groups in the U.S. tried and failed to appeal to then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to allow the ship to land in Florida. The ship returned to Europe, where 254 of the 937 passengers died in the Holocaust. Britain and other countries continued to not appreciate the real threat that the Nazis posed, not only to Europe, but world stability. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had a series of failed attempts at allowing Hitler to annex land and believing that doing so would fulfill his need and stop him from continuing to do so. This included the Anschluss, or annexation of Austria, in 1938. Many in Europe were very wary of another war after the complete devastation of the First World War, and they were trying to do everything possible to not get into another war. It had only ended 20 years before and wiped out a generation. After Anschluss, it became clear to Europe's leaders that Hitler was not going to stop his territorial expansion, which he had referred to as Germany's need for Lebensraum, or living space. They agreed then that if Hitler were to invade Poland, it would mean war. Given his past success with what would now be called appeasers, he decided to take his chances. And Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The Second World War had begun. Though the Poles fought valiantly, the nations that would become allies were unprepared and provided little to no assistance for their fight. The Polish government fled to London to spend war in exile. Much to the consternation of those who had put their faith and allegiance in the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, that country now made a non-aggression pact with the fascists. This meant that the party line out of Moscow was that the Allies and the Nazis should fight it out. In the meantime, the Soviet Union occupied half of Poland for their participation in the deal. Poland was now split between German occupation and Soviet occupation. In the United States, in 1940, FDR won the 1940 election for an unprecedented third term with a strong anti-war position. However, he increasingly found ways to support the Allies, such as the Lend-Lease program, without formal entry by the United States into the war until Pearl Harbor. FDR was well aware of the threat that Hitler posed to world stability. Meanwhile, the Nazis successfully took most of Western Europe, including Paris, but failed to successfully beat Britain by air in the Battle of Britain, also in 1940. Britain would remain one of the last holdouts in Western Europe against the fascist tide under its new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was quickly brought into power after the resignation of Chamberlain due to his failure to successfully contain Hitler. Given Hitler's success in Western Europe, with the tactic of the fast-moving blitzkrieg, which saw Allied troops defeated and pushed off of the continent at the loss of Dunkirk in 1940. On June 22nd, 1941, and much to Stalin's surprise, Hitler violated the Stalin-Hitler Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and invaded the Soviet Union in violation. Germany had launched a war in the East known as Operation Barbarossa. The geographic area this encompassed would become the worst killing zone of the Holocaust. As a combination of Nazi death camps and SS mobile killing squads known as the Einsatzgruppen worked together to inflict mass death on Europe's Jewish population. The Holocaust by bullets was combined with the camps to nearly successfully annihilate Europe's Jewish community. These photos here are the invasion of the Soviet Union, and then some of the effects of people that were at Babylon. While the deportation of Western Europe's Jewish communities to the east continued, the Nazis, with the Einsatzgruppen at their spearhead, began to encounter some of the largest Jewish populations in Europe as Operation Barbarossa moved east. The ideology of Lebensraum, or living space, for the Germans, coupled with seeing all peoples of the East as inferior Slavs, quote unquote, led to mass killing on a scale not seen thus far in the war in the West. During the war in the East, approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war were murdered, along with 1.8 million non-Jewish Poles. But no group was singled out for complete annihilation for their supposed crimes against humanity of starting 2 world wars in the same way as the Jews. As the Nazi ideology of Jew hatred combined with the reality of coming into contact with the largest number of Jews in the war so far, the results were catastrophic. One example of particular brutality of the Nazi killing squads as they pushed further into the east was the massacre of Babyn Ravine, which is currently located just outside of present-day Kyiv in Ukraine. And what was one of the worst massacres during the Holocaust, over the course of 2 days, September 29th through 30th, 33,771 Jews were massacred by mass shooting carried out by the SS and German police battalions. It remained a key killing site for the next 2 years. In addition, multiple pogroms were carried out by local populations against their neighbors during this period, as the chaos of the war in the East created new opportunities for the realization of Jew hatred on a local level. One of the best known of these is the Jedwabne program in Poland that saw the Christian Polish half of the town decide at a town hall meeting to massacre the Jewish half of the town. The brutality of this action, carried out not by the SS, but by local people, saw the Jews of the town beaten to death, beheaded, burned alive in a barn by their former acquaintances. The people of the town subsequently stole property, money, and clothing from their neighbors, and in later years attempted to deny what had happened. Actions of this type happened in multiple places in eastern Poland and western Ukraine during 1941. Approximately 2 million Jews were murdered over the next few years by shootings, massacres, and pogroms. The United States finally entered the war when Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7, 1941. Here we can see the Holocaust by bullets, the display of the murders by the Einsatzgruppen, and the numbers of deaths that were caused by them. On January 15th, 1942, the Wannsee Conference was held where officials of the SS and the German government came together to finalize and coordinate what they called the, quote, final solution to the Jewish question. While up to this point there had been ghettoization, deportation, and mass killing, it was still not formalized officially. At this conference, the SD chief Reinhard Heydrich informed the participants of Hitler's plan for the coordinated and systematic annihilation of all of Europe's Jews, including those from Great Britain and elsewhere. He estimated this to be 11 million. Following the conference, 5 additional extermination camps were brought into operation, in addition to Chelmno, that was currently operating at the time. These include Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Approximately 2.7 million Jews were murdered in these camps over the next few years. The concentration of local Jewish populations into ghettos have been taking place since the beginning of the war, and this centralization of the Jewish populations became a way for the Nazis to easily round up and deport Jews for the death in the camps. In spite of this, the centralized nature of the ghettos meant community and survival for those that remained. However, the ghettos were often destroyed not long after in what became known as liquidation actions. There was a danger in Jews being concentrated for too long for the Nazis. Those who were able to escape the ghettos and the camps had a very difficult time trying to survive on the outside, but some went into hiding and some did survive. This is a map of some of the ghettos in Eastern Europe. Here are the extermination camps as of 1944. There was a myth of lack of resistance by Jews to their fate, as some saying they went like, quote unquote, lambs to the slaughter. This was the perception from the earlier days of Nazi rule. The sheer inconceivability of what was happening meant that some did not resist as early as they might have had the full scale of Nazi extermination been clear. Many people simply didn't believe that it was happening. However, there were acts of resistance, large and small, that helped some to survive. Uprisings took place at the death camps of Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, after one of the best-known acts of resistance, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, on April 19th, 1943. When it began against the odds, and despite the certainty of deportation and death, it resulted in approximately 7,000 Jews in the ghetto dying, fighting, and an additional 7,000 being transported to Treblinka and murdered. The remaining 42,000 Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto were sent to forced labor camps and executed in a November 2-day massacre called Operation Harvest Festival. Here's a map of some of the instances of resistance from 1941 to 1944. It should be noted that this is armed resistance in ghettos and camps. There were many different types of resistance that people undertook, even down to the personal level. On the war front, things had begun going very badly for the Nazis. They lost one of the bloodiest battles of the war when the Soviet Red Army successfully beat them at Stalingrad in February 1943. Many saw this as a psychological turning point of the war. On the Western Front, June 6, 1944, saw the Allies land on the beaches at Normandy and began to reclaim territory from the Nazis. By this point, however, 5 million of the 6 million Jews that would die in the Holocaust had already perished. The Allies' gains on the Western Front and the Red Army's counteroffensive on the Eastern Front would both end in Germany, seeing a defeated country split between East and West and bringing about what would become known as the Cold War. In January of 1944, the FDR administration created the War Refugee Board to coordinate the rescue of Europe's Jews. However, sadly, most of Europe's Jews who were to die in the Holocaust had already been murdered. The creation of the War Refugee Board, with the help of the government, did save the lives of many who would have been otherwise murdered. But it was far too little, far too late for most. As 1944 progressed, it was clear that the Nazis were going to lose the war. This did not stop them, however, from continuing to carry out their mission of annihilating Europe's Jews. This resulted in 1944 and 1945 what were known as the death marches. Those who had survived the ghettos, camps, and killing squads were now subjected to a final degradation. As the Allies approached to liberate the camps, and as the Nazis tried to destroy the evidence, they forced any remaining prisoners to march, often aimlessly, often without clothing or food, in order to fulfill their mission to keep prisoners from being able to tell the Allies about what they had experienced. Prisoners were treated brutally, many being executed on the spot for failing to keep up. Thousands died on the cusp of liberation from starvation, exposure, and exhaustion. On January 27, 1945, the Soviet Red Army liberated Auschwitz. The date was later to become International Holocaust Remembrance Day. The Americans liberated Buchenwald and Dachau. The British liberated Bergen-Belsen. Even these liberations did not stop Jewish death, however, as many died of typhus, malnutrition, or disease in the months immediately after liberation. The horrors of the camps that the Allies discovered have become a central part of Holocaust memory and education. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in a Berlin bunker with a gunshot to the head. In his final statement, his Jew hatred remained as strong as ever as he proclaimed international Jewry, quote unquote, for the war and his defeat. On May 8th, 1945, Europe celebrated VE, or Victory in Europe Day, as Germany surrendered. The Second World War would continue in the Pacific until August 1945. Here's a map of some of the major death marches that took place. Here's a map of the liberation of the camps. That anyone survived in the utter chaos and destruction of the Holocaust is a testament to the human spirit. That the Jewish people were able to survive as a group, despite a nearly successful attempt to annihilate them in our living memory, is a testament to their strength. You now have a chance to listen to some of these survivors by going to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial website, listening to testimony at the USC Shoah Foundation website, and you can learn about the individual journeys that they undertook in the midst of such devastation. Through this, you can discover why we should never stop telling the story of the Holocaust, and why the history of the Holocaust and the lessons from that history are more important than ever. Thank you.